our country who are aware of Christian Heritage Academy, of the mission, and join us in that. And we've been pleased in the past couple of months to have some speakers come and speak to us about our country and how God has blessed it and how God has a purpose for our country. And such is the case today. Last month we had Dr. Paul Jaley with us, and this morning Charlie Meadows, who is the man who is responsible. God is using him to bring in different speakers into the state of Oklahoma to share with us about our American Christian heritage. And he's going to come and introduce our speaker today. Our speaker has been with us before, but it's been many years. But I think you will enjoy him tremendously. So let's welcome Mr. Meadows as he comes.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to take much time. I'm just going to introduce Bill. He's probably been speaking and writing books for over 25 years now. He's written over 20 books. There's not a Christian publication he's not written in, been published in. There's not a Christian radio program, a Christian TV program, and many secular programs that have asked him to come on and speak. He's written over 20 books. Please welcome Bill Federer. He's one of the best known and most articulate Christians, and he's going to be talking to you about a very important issue today, and that is socialism. Bill, thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Well, it's great to be with you, and it's a tremendous honor, and God has a great plan for each and every one of you. And one of the topics that is in the news a lot is socialism. So I wrote a book. It's called Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present, and let's get into some of it. So all stories of of socialism goes back to Plato. He was a Greek philosopher that lived in Athens about 380 BC. And Plato writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly structured civilization on an island. It's very advanced and militaristic, and it sinks in the ocean. Now, did it really exist? Nobody knows for sure, but there is an island in the Mediterranean that used to be a volcano, and it blew up, and all that's left is the rim of the volcano. It's called Santorini. I actually went in college over to Europe and saw it. We went there. You probably see it in tourist pictures because it's all painted white, whitewashed with blue. It's really pretty along the rim of this, what used to be a volcano. So there was a volcano that blew up, and it would have sent a massive tsunami all across the Mediterranean and sunk just about everything. So who knows? That could have been where Atlantis was. But Plato thinks that it did exist, and Plato considered Atlantis as the ideal structured society. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. So Athens had a democracy. Demos means people, krasi means rule. So in a democracy, the people rule. And the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful. He called it a charming form of government, like a bazaar where you can buy anything, like a piece of embroidery and the manners of men, the greatest variety of human natures. And so democracy, they tolerate each other. And then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. And he says, such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless sort of government, a charming form of government full of variety and disorder. And then he says the manner of life is that of Democrats. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. Now, he's using that word Democrats because he's describing a democracy. But it's this idea that they're tolerating everything now. Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And he says the father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son and fear him, and the son having no shame or fear of his parents. And the teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors. And he says, then this gets into this lawlessness into their handling of finances. And it's a democracy, so they vote to spread the city money around, the treasury. Now the treasury's empty. Then they vote to take the money from the rich people. And he says, the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people, at the same time taking care to reserve the larger part for themselves. Democracy's instability brings her to disillusion. So now they're having this tolerance and lawlessness get into their morality. And he says, the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. Yes, that's what he's talking about. He has parted company with all shame. And so now this immorality is being tolerated. And lo and behold, an anthropologist named J.D. Unwin wrote a book, Sex and Culture, in 1934. And he studied Athens, and he studied 80 civilizations over 5,000 years and found out that sexual promiscuity always precedes civilizational decline. And so he said civilizations go through a period of pain and poverty, like a war or a famine, and then they work hard to get out of it, and they become productive and protective and patriotic. And finally, they become prosperous, and they begin to enjoy all their prosperity, and they get pleasure-focused. And then they get a little lazy, and they get sexually promiscuous, indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, and weakened, and then they get conquered by the next civilization that comes along. Sort of like an athlete. When he's young, he's focused and disciplined and exercises and watches his diet, and he wants that prize. And finally, he wins. He's the champ. And he rules for a couple seasons, and then he gets a little bit lazy, maybe eats stuff that's a little fatty, and maybe doesn't exercise quite as much. In his mind, he still thinks he's the tough guy. And he gets into the ring of competition, and he gets the tar knocked out of him because in reality, he's a couch potato. And that's what happens with civilizations, right? And so J.D. Unwin actually called it the sexual marketplace. Now, he's not a Christian. This is 1934. He says, when women say there has to be a commitment before anything happens, the men say, well, whatever it takes, and they make the commitment, and then there's little kids that appear, and the men end up being protective and productive to provide for their wives and family. And when all the men of the country become protective and productive, the country, rising water floats all boats, and the whole country ends up becoming more prosperous, more productive, and they become expansionistic and creative. But when the women say, well, there doesn't need to be a commitment, water seeks its own level. You'll have a bunch of guys saying, hey, well, let's have fun. And what happens is the guys focus, instead of becoming productive and protective, it becomes pleasure-focused and selfish and indulgent. And lo and behold, there's fewer children. And when all the men of the country get pleasure-focused and sensual and lazy, the country gets weakened. And there's fewer children born to fill the ranks of the military. And when the country gets weakened, they get conquered by the next civilization that comes along. He says that he studied 80 civilizations over 5,000 years, and he said it always is this way. So John Adams writes to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Harry S. Truman writes, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. And so, Plato says that democracy is based on the people having morals and virtue, but if they don't have morals and virtue, they tolerate people that are a little bit off. They tolerate people that are a lot off. They're probably tolerating crooks and crime and fraud and immorality, creeps into their finances, and now it's turning into chaos. And there's lawlessness and looting and stores being robbed and people smashing windows, and everybody begins to say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's when some governor comes along and says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. And at first, he's a protector. It says, the last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's the protector. I want to protect you. I want to do all this stuff because I want to protect you. And he's full of smiles. But he begins to consolidate power. And then Plato says, if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he will have a good pretense for destroying them. And so finally, this protector is standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand. He's revealed as a tyrant absolute. And then he uses a mob, having a mob entirely at his disposal. He's not restrained from shedding of blood. So here we have this scenario. Democracy is based on the people having morals and virtue. When they give up their morals and virtue, it turns into chaos. After that chaos gets worse and worse, the people say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And the rubber band snaps back, and you get a tyrant king. Plato says that it's going to happen. Democracy's doomed to fail because people really don't have virtue. He said if you give people a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. Now, ancient Israel attempted, and they did, have a government where there was no king for 400 years before King Saul. And their experiment lasted a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God. And so people were virtuous because they were accountable to God. Athens didn't have that. Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway during Plato's time. So Plato says this democracy is based on virtue, and people will only be virtuous as long as it's the in thing to be virtuous. But finally, they'll give up their virtue. And he says, if anyone was born that truly had virtue, the world would crucify him. So here's Plato. He writes this. If a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He writes this 380 years before Jesus. He says, people really aren't virtuous. If anyone with virtue was really born, the world would crucify him. Isn't that interesting? So Plato says that democracy is going to fail, and so the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king, and he is the head of gold. And his administrator, military, the deep state crony political class, they are the arms and chest of silver. And they are the ruling class. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze, the peasants. They are the ruled class. So socialism is a structured society, right? Democracy is unstructured, and socialism is structured. Socialism is a structured society with a ruling class and a ruled class. Now, the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoners, and they can do special things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. I don't know if you remember that. There was this Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. She goes to California. All the hairstylist stores are shut down, but she gets to go in there and get her hair styled, even though it's illegal for everybody else. And so the ruling class, they can do this type of stuff. The ruled class, the commoners, the abdomen of iron and bronze, in socialism, they own no property. They have no families. There's no families in socialism. The government decides who gets to have children. And the government takes the children away from the parents and brings them into public schools where they're socialized, which is a process of getting them to give up their parents' values and learn how to simply obey and believe whatever the state tells them. And Plato says that this structured society, he writes, when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And he says the kids will be taught noble lies. They'll be taught lies. He says we want one single grand lie which will be believed by everybody. Could you imagine kids being taken away from their parents, brought into a public school and taught lies? And so Plato's structured society on the island of Atlantis, that inspired someone around 2,000 years later, Sir Thomas More. And this is 20 years after Columbus discovers the New World, he says, oh, New World? Hey, maybe there's some, opportunities for new societies. And so he writes in 1516, Island of Utopia. Now, the word utopia means nowhere. And it's a fictitious island off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. And it's written as a Greek dialogue, a conversation with a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. So here's this island of nowhere, and it's talked about this peddler of nonsense. And on the island of Utopia, it's perfectly structured. And there's the upper class that are rulers and the lower class commoners. There's free health care. There's free identical clothing. There's free welfare for everybody. There's free common meals in communal monastic dining halls. There is, everyone lives in identical 3-story public housing. There are no locks on any doors. There's no private property. And all property and goods are stored in a communal warehouse. And there's no taverns, ale houses, or coffee houses. There's no places for private gatherings. There's no privacy. And everyone is tracked everywhere they go with an internal passport. And if you're caught without it, it's a lifetime of slavery. And the government decides everyone's careers, that you have to work the rest of your life. And there's no families. Again, the government decides who gets to have children, and childbearing is regulated by the government. This is sort of like China's one-child policy, or Planned Parenthood's Margaret Sanger that said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. And so, this is utopia. This is this perfect structured society. So we got Plato's island of Atlantis, we got Sir Thomas More's island of Utopia, and we got Sir Francis Bacon in 1626 writes the New Atlantis. Why did he name it New Atlantis? Because he's directly referencing Plato's Atlantis. And Sir Francis Bacon lives at the time of William Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth, and the Pilgrims. And so Sir Francis Bacon, his New Atlantis, it's a fictitious island in the South Pacific off the coast of Peru. It's highly structured with the ruling class and the ruled class. Everyone has more scientific careers because he helped start the scientific revolution where they discovered there's laws of planetary motion and laws of gravity and so forth. But the government decides everyone's careers. Someone wrote a satire on this, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Here's Gulliver washed up on an island, Lilliput, and he finds it's perfectly structured with a ruling class and the ruled class. And the ruling class is so ridiculous in wanting to control every little piece of somebody's life, and then the ruled class, they just have to obey, right? Why is this important? The Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims were originally a company colony. What's a company colony? That means there's rich guys that pitch in money to pay for it. And they want to get a profit, and they write the bylaws. So the bylaws are written by these investors who look back to Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon, and lo and behold, the Pilgrims try it and nearly starve to death. The bylaws say, all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or by any other means shall remain in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, apparel, and all provisions out of ye common stock. And Governor William Bradford of the Pilgrims said, the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. Lo and behold, the Pilgrims knew that they were attempting to live out this Plato and Utopia, this everything's owned in common, and they nearly starved to death. He says that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter of what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc. with the humbler and younger ones thought it some indignity and disrespect. As for men's wives who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Let no one argue that this is due to human failing. Rather, than to this communistic plan of life in itself, I answered that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So William Bradford goes on. So they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop than they had done, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want, like starving through a winter. At length, after much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. You plant corn for your household. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So we got Plato's or Thomas More's or Francis Bacon, this theoretical, these guys sitting around the table, hey, let's have everything owned in common, and the pilgrims try to live it, and they nearly starve to death. They scrap it. They give everybody their own plot of land. Everybody ends up working hard, and then they have an abundance, right? Now, didn't the early church own everything in common? Well, two very important differences: voluntary versus involuntary, and church versus government. So the early church, they voluntarily sold their property, and they brought the money to the feet of the apostles. They were not forced to involuntarily sell their property and lay it at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to spread around. So voluntary is a big deal with God, right? You think of it, God makes everything. I was watching a video on the Hubble telescope, and they, 2003, focused it on a part of the sky where there was nothing. And so this telescope is like a satellite, circles the earth so the atmosphere doesn't block it. And if you were to take a grain of sand, hold it out at arm's length against the sky, that's how tiny the spot was that they focused this Hubble telescope on for 2 weeks. And afterwards, they developed the images. And they found in that spot was 10,000 galaxies, with 1 trillion stars in each galaxy in that teeny little spot. And then they started looking over here. They found out that there's trillions and trillions of galaxies that they had not known before. And so you think of it, wow, God is immense. God is powerful. Matter of fact, God is all-powerful. Here's God. He exists for eternity. He knows everything. He makes everything. And everything obeys him. Everything follows rules. And at some point in eternity past, God said, I would like someone in my image that could love me. Well, now it gets interesting, because love, by definition, must be voluntary. And if God forces you to love him, he would know that he's forcing you to love him, and he would know that it's really not a voluntary response, right? Love must be voluntary. And so God creates this thing we called reality, and you really can't control anything except your will. And you have choices to either choose him or not choose him. He hides himself behind creation, because if he ever revealed himself in all of his awesomeness, we would all instinctively, here's the creator that created billions and trillions of stars, right? We would instinctively fall down and worship him, and he wouldn't know if we're worshiping him because he's just awesome or because we really love him. I told my son, I said, it's like a billionaire who has a son that goes away to college, and he drives onto campus with his Maserati, and his fancy clothes, gold rings, and he'll have every girl wanting to be friends with him. But if he lays that aside and drives to campus in an old clunker, and he's got holes in his jeans, all the uppity girls will ignore him. But then some girl likes to study with him in the library, and they get to become friends, and they go out and have an ice cream cone together, and they get to be good friends. They end up falling in love. They end up getting engaged. And then he says, hey, I want to take you back to meet my dad. And they're driving up to this mansion and this castle, and she's like, whoa. So Jesus, if he would have come to earth with all of his glory, every political ladder climber would want to be buttering up to him. But he lays all that aside, and he comes to earth humbled as a man, so that only those that love him for him respond. So the voluntary thing is a big deal with God, right? And then the early church, they laid the money at the feet. They sold their property, laid it at the feet of the apostles. When the church helps people, it wants the people to get up out of their bad situation and become successful. Why? So they can help the next person that comes along with a need. Whenever the government helps people, it's an exchange for something. Like in Egypt, oh, you need grain? We'll give you grain, but we're going to give it in exchange for your cattle, your land, your children, your lives. So whenever the government gives something, it's giving it because it wants to control you. When the church gives it, it wants you to be more independent, more successful, so you can help other people. When the government gives anything. Now, one of the confusions is the role of government. And so God gives commands to 5 main groups: individuals, families, businesses, church, and government. The commands to individuals do include helping the poor. Did you know there's really no commands for families to help the poor? Those commands are husband, love your wives, and children, submit to your parents. The commands to business are don't hold back the wages and do an honest day's work. There are commands for the church to take care of the poor. And historically, the church has. And the church has started orphanages and medical clinics and soup kitchens and dug wells in villages. Did you know there's no command for the government to help the poor? The command of the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And people say, well, we need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it is not the government's job to do it. Whenever the government does it, it's in exchange, and the person that's in the government position is going to be tempted to dole out the benefits to those that can help them and use their position to shut up those that are wanting to put them out of a job. There's a great quote from Calvin Coolidge. He says, "It does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it." Well, we need to do this, we need to do this. Yes, but it's not the government's job. A great quote from Gerald Ford. He says, "People say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take away from us everything we have?" And that's the danger. So the Pilgrims, they scrap their company bylaws and they embrace a covenant form of government. It's the difference between involuntary and voluntary. So a covenant, it's you're caring for each other because you're accountable to God. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these my brethren, you do unto me. It's voluntary. And you get rights from God. And so the Pilgrims were really into the Bible, the ancient Israel. They even taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And so if you think of government as a line, one side is total government, the other side is no government. Total government, you end up getting a government, a state, a dictator, a tyrant king, and he rules through fear. You do what he says, or he kills you, right? The no government side is anarchy, unless the people have virtue. And what's virtue? Well, that's everybody being taught the law and voluntarily following the law. I was trying to think of a way of explaining this, and I thought of how many of you have an iPhone or an Android, and you have GPS, and it tells you how to turn left 50 yards ahead, right? You don't need somebody in the car giving you directions. You can get there yourself. You got your own app. Imagine if there was a behavioral app that taught you how to act in real time, right? It's watching you, says, now don't lose your temper at that person. I see you, don't steal that off that table, right? It's a behavioral app. And the Levite priests in ancient Israel were the computer geeks that helped you to download the app. Now, how do you download it? Well, you got to go to Apple Play, Google Store. You got to press this button, line upon line, precept upon precept. So everybody downloads their own copy of the law. But the question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Well, ancient Israel had the key ingredient, right? There is a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something, nobody's around, you know you can get away with it, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. So it creates something in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order with no police. Maximum liberty. Women can go anywhere without fear, right? Now, God knew that the ancient Israelites would sin, and rather than them walk around forever with a guilty conscience, once a year they had the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where they had this sacrifice, where one of the goats they would kill and take the blood into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle it on the mercy seat. The blood changed it from a judgment seat into a mercy seat. And then the other goat, high priest would put his hands on its head and confess the sins of the country over the animal. And then by the hand of a young man, it would be led out far, far, far into the wilderness and let go, never to be seen again. And it was symbolic of Jesus, right? Jesus is our sacrifice, and his blood was put on the altar, and he separated us from our sins. As far as the east is from the west, we'll never see him again. And so now the children of Israel could get a clean conscience every year to start over again. Ronald Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. And so if there's no God, laws are just made up by some old men somewhere. Why follow them? Some will, as long as it's socially acceptable. Others are going to say, forget this, and they're going to yield to their selfish side. And they're going to start robbing and killing and stealing and smashing windows and setting buildings on fire. And it's going to turn into lawlessness and chaos and an unstructured mess. And then everyone's going to say, we need someone to come along and fix this mess. So what happened with ancient Israel? Well, the priest stopped teaching the law. The high priest, Eli, his own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. They're not following the law. And then another story of a Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. And you're thinking, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them. And then a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite is to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. And so they're traveling, and they're in a house surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the very last stages of a people ruling themselves. This casting off of self-restraint, this abandonment to passion. So just like Plato says, the young man gives into libertinism and useless unnecessary pleasures. And so this is what happened with ancient Israel, right? You got the high priest's own kids are sleeping with women. There's sexual immorality, and there's another Levite with a concubine. And then there's sodomites banging on the door. And when you're done with that chapter, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Where have we seen that before? Right? Oh, yeah. And so it turns into an unstructured mess. And so what happened was they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, we want a philosopher. We want somebody to restore order. And so they ask for a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells him, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And so they get a king, Saul. He reigns as a tyrant. And he's upset that his son Jonathan became friends with David. And he says to his soldiers, none of you soldiers care about me. And one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, said, King, I care. I saw David go to this town. The priests gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul says, bring those priests to me. He turns to his soldiers and he says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate. And Doeg the Edomite says, I'll kill them, and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system where each person is accountable to God to follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one witness, this Doeg guy. And so the soldiers are saying, okay, you're telling me to kill. There's only one witness. God says I have to have 2, and I'm accountable to God. The soldiers are hesitating. They still have a conscience. Doeg the Edomite says, King, you tell me to kill, I'll kill. You tell me to, kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill the baby in the womb. You tell me there's no more marriage and there's no more male and female, okay, fine. Whatever you tell me, king, whatever you tell me, government, whatever you tell me, I'll throw away the habits of my parents. I'll throw away my beliefs. I'll just embrace whatever the state tells me to believe, right? The government always wants to insert itself between you and God. Like Nebuchadnezzar, when I blow my trumpets, you bow to my statue, right? And so, socialism wants there to be domestic chaos and lawlessness and sexual immorality. Why? To have chaos. And once there's chaos, people say, we need the government to come in and restore order, and that's when they usurp power and they institute a dictatorship. Now, I don't have time to go into it all, but the next chapter in my book is on the French Revolution, and they helped us with our revolution, but afterwards they had a lot of debt and famine, and they said if we can just chop the king and queen's heads off, our problems will be solved. And they chop off King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and it doesn't get any better. So then they chop off the heads of the wealthy, doesn't get any better. They chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers, doesn't get any better. Chop off the heads of the hoarders. You got extra, I don't have enough, you're selfish. Chop off the heads of the clergy because they're speaking out against the head chopping off stuff. They chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, and 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris during their revolution. And the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity was their word for socialism. It's the group, it's the collective, and equality can be understood two ways. In America, equality was equal treatment before the law and equal opportunity. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternité, the group, the socialist state, thinks you have too much stuff, it can use the power of the state to take away your stuff and kill you. And so that's what happened in France. And anyway, then they also wanted to get rid of history. So they're tearing down statues like good King Henry IV, and they dig up the grave of this young woman, St. Genevieve, who got all of Paris to fast and pray when Attila was destroying Europe, and Attila skipped sacking Paris, so she's considered the patron saint of Paris, St. Genevieve. Well, during this French Revolution, they want to get rid of history, so they trash her grave. This is a concept called deconstruction, where you separated people from their past, get them into a neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. Right? It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. You're still brushing with that old stuff? Haven't you read that it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, really? Now I got you into a neutral, you're open-minded. And what are all the toothpastes out there? Then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar-controlled breath freshener toothpaste. So that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. Forget the fact that they gave us a country where we get to be in charge of our life. And so the students are repulsed by all these founding fathers, and they're in a neutral position. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems that are out there nowadays? Then they get a pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. So it's a drive neutral reverse. And Europe went through this. It went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods to a secular Europe with the French Revolution and free sex, anything goes, and now it's turning into a socialist Sharia Europe where the government controls everyone's lives. I've talked to people over there. The government pays for all your education. That's nice. But then if you don't score good on a test, the government will channel you into career paths. And what if you decide that, no, I want to be a doctor, too late. You can't switch. I've talked to people that they've tried to switch and they scored bad on a couple tests. And it was impossible. The government wouldn't pay for them to switch, so they're stuck in this career path. And so anyway, this tearing down of history happened in China. And so there's the Warring States period, 3rd century BC, and half a dozen Chinese kingdoms, and one wins. And it's Qin Shi Huangdi. And Qin Shi Huangdi was being criticized for doing things differently than they had been done before. And he got tired of being criticized, so he decided to destroy all historical records of how things were done before. And he burnt all these Chinese bamboo annal books, and that set an example. I, your servant, propose that all historians' records, other than those of Quin's, be burned. And if anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be executed, and anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed. So we're running out of time, and the same thing happens with Mao Zedong in China with the Cultural Revolution, and then it also happens in Pol Pot in Cambodia. He made 1975 the new year zero, said anything prior to that was irrelevant, and he killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history. And then whenever Muslims take over a country, they destroy history. They destroy the statues and so forth. And so now we got a 619 project in the Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which is what? It's designed to say all the negative things possible about the past. Why? So that you will emotionally detach from it. And then they get you into a neutral where you're open-minded. Then they give you their pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. Well, I'm out of time. There's a whole lot more there, and it's in a book. And the title of my book is Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present. And my website's AmericanMinute.com. And I'll leave my book as an e-book with Josh Bullard, and then you can maybe get it from him. So did you get anything out of this today? All right. Well, thank you. We don't have time for questions, I guess. All right. I said we don't have time for questions, probably. All right.
Let's give Mr. Federer a big hand again, all right? As you can tell, he is a wealth of information, and one of the things that I appreciate about him, because I followed him, I print off, I used to print off every day his American Minute that he publishes and goes on the radio every day. And I have a big thick stack of things that he's done. It's just a wealth of information, but he is consistently sharing the truth of why God established America and the dangers now that are facing our country. And I really appreciate that from you, brother. So thank you for being with us today. We have a small announcement. It's about tonight's band concert. And so we've got some video that we're going to show. I think one of the media people said that, and we'll do that. And then after that, we will be dismissed. Are we ready for that, Mr. Hartman? Here we go.